Okay, then, so let's turn to Mark's Gospel. And you may remember yesterday we talked about how when we read our Bibles, we are coming face to face with God. And what we are not meant to do is hold up the Bible like a mirror so that we see ourselves. It seems that for lots of people, the Bible is that mirror. It's a way in which we just look at ourselves and see what we ought to do and how we ought to be. And sometimes preachers will give us that message, won't they? Where they'll turn to a passage and they'll say, this is what you ought to be like. Well, the whole function of our Bible is to bring us face to face with God. And I think there's a passage in Mark's Gospel that perfectly illustrates this principle. So let's begin there, and then we'll look at the structure of Mark as a whole, and we'll look at a couple of his themes, okay? But first of all, let's reinforce this idea that when we turn to the Bible, we are looking into the face of God, not holding up a mirror to ourselves. So turn to Mark 12 and verses 41 to 44. Okay, Mark 12, 41 to 44. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans. And so he called his disciples to himself and said to them, assuredly I say to you, that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they put in out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. Now, I've heard many sermons over the years, and I'm sure you have, in which we are told that this passage tells us that we have to give what we got. And it doesn't matter how little we have to give. And the message becomes about us and the need for us to give to God, give what we can, give the small talents, whatever it is. Okay, that's not the purpose of this passage at all. The purpose of the passage you see in the first verse, verse 41. Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw. Here is Emmanuel, Jesus, the Son of God, in the temple, which is the symbol of the presence of God. And he is looking, and he's looking at the worshippers, and he's looking at the comings and goings of the people. So this is a passage about how God observes us and what God notices. And God observes and notices what everybody else fails to see. So nobody would have looked at this woman and noticed what she was doing. And if they had, by chance, they would have despised what she was doing. So this passage is about God who observes, who notices, who is aware, and who commends even the least of what we're able to do. So use this passage to remind yourself that we don't look at the Bible to find instruction about ourselves. We are brought to look at God. And here is a God who notices the insignificant, who notices the least, and who commends that. That's who our God is. Okay, then, so Mark's Gospel. So for many then, this is the account of Peter. Peter's time spent with Christ. Peter doesn't write it himself. He doesn't think that he is worthy and ought to because of what happens in this account in terms of his denial of Christ. So we have traditionally thought that Mark was John Mark, the character that you meet fleeing naked at the end of the Gospel. Now, of course, recent scholarship is saying that no, we don't know who wrote Mark's Gospel. We don't think it's John Mark. But traditionally, I think for biblical scholars, we have seen it as John Mark. But it's Peter's account. It's the first of the Gospels to be written. And from Mark's Gospel, both Matthew and Luke take their lead, if you like. and they both then build on what Mark tells us. And we saw yesterday that Mark's account is an action-based account. He is presenting Christ to the Roman world, and he's doing so in terms of the action of Christ, the work of Christ, the miracles of Christ, the person of Christ. So it's very fast-moving. It's very dramatic. It's a series of scenes in which you meet Christ in action. So there are 3 sections then to Mark's Gospel, and it's quite easy. When I was first a Christian, I was encouraged to look at Mark's Gospel. There was a study series called Read, Mark, Learn, which I can remember doing in my early days as a Christian. So very simple structure to the Gospel, 3 sections. So if you've got Mark in front of you, Mark 1 verse 1, and look, you start straight away in the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And the first section takes us to chapter 9 and verse 50. And that's known as the Galilean ministry of Jesus. So it's all that he does and who he meets and the miracles he performs whilst in Galilee up in the north. Okay? And Galilee then will be the place where he will meet with his disciples as arranged following his resurrection. So the Galilean ministry. And then the second section of Mark is chapter 10. And what you have in chapter 10 is the journey to Jerusalem. So Jesus is moving down from the Galilean region where he's been for some considerable time, and Mark constructs it then as one journey to Jerusalem. John tells us that he had 3 journeys to Jerusalem during his time of ministry, but for Mark it's condensed into one journey to Jerusalem. That's Mark and chapter 10, second section. And then the third section from chapter 11 verse 1, so you see it there. Now when they drew near Jerusalem to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives. So from chapter 11 verse 1, for the rest of the gospel, you have the events in Jerusalem in that fateful week. Okay, so very easy structure to this gospel. Mark isn't concerned, as most of the others really aren't, with chronology. He edits his material in order to present Christ in the way that he wishes to. So here's Christ presented to the Roman world. And what we've noticed before when we've looked at Mark is Mark, Peter, whoever, takes a very dim view of the 12 disciples. And they are portrayed negatively throughout the gospel. They are presented as people, men who don't understand, who miss the point, who get it wrong, who fail time and time again to show faith. And by contrast to the disciples, Mark has a series of characters whom he presents to us throughout his gospel, who run to Jesus, kneel before him, ask him to help them. And these characters, they're sometimes called the minor ones. That's almost like a title. They are presented positively throughout. Now, of course, the big moment when these disciples fail the most is to believe the resurrection accounts. So if you just turn across to Mark 16, you'll see there that there is a rebuke from Jesus to the disciples. And this rebuke is on the occasion of the resurrection, but it's an all-encompassing rebuke. Throughout this gospel, they are not presented in a favorable light. So in Mark 16, you can see verse 14. This is later on the day of the resurrection. We read this. Later he, Jesus, appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table. And he rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. So that's typical of how these men are presented throughout the gospel. And if I just show you by contrast how there's a positive presentation of these minor ones, these minor characters. So there are several of them. I'm not going to show you them all, but just to give you a sense of how this gospel is dotted with positive vignettes, if you like, positive scenes in which there are certain characters who are commended. So in Mark, let's have a look at Mark 1. And from Mark 1, we have verse 40, we have the leper. So look at Mark 1, verse 40. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now that verse is typical of these minor characters, how they behave. They come to him, and there's a sequence of action verbs there. Did you notice? One after the other after the other. Look at verse 40 again. The leper comes, the leper implores, the leper kneels, the leper says. Those are 4 action verbs that are stressing the urgency of the leper's case, but also of his view of Jesus. That he is coming to one whom he believes will help him. So a positive picture there of the leper. And if you go into chapter 5, you get 2 minor characters in chapter 5. You've got this Gerasene demoniac, first of all. And of course, he doesn't exactly come, but he does in verse 6, if you notice. He sees Jesus from afar, and he ran and he worshipped. So there's the same idea there of those action verbs. He sees, he runs, he worships. And this is a man with a demon. And then as you go down the chapter, you get Jairus with his daughter. And look at verse 22. Behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and he saw him, and he fell at his feet, and he begged him earnestly, and he said, now do you get the idea? He comes, he runs, he begs, he says. These are all the positive ways in which these minor ones are depicted in this gospel. They come to Jesus, they beg him, they implore him. Now, by contrast, our 12 stumble, and they're slow, and they don't understand, and they often don't believe. Let me show you one last minor one that you get in Mark's gospel, and chapter 7. And she's very well known because not only does she come and beg and implore, but she actually argues with Jesus. So this is Mark 7, and she's known as the Syro-Phoenician woman. Mark 7 and verse 25. A woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and she fell at his feet. Now there's your typical way in which these minor ones are being introduced. She comes, she falls, and she kept asking. Look at verse 26. The woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast out the demons. And then Jesus does this very mysterious thing of sort of testing. And then she says, verse 26, yes, Lord, even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs. So here are these positive portrayals of outsiders, people on the margins, people who would have had very little direct contact with Jesus prior to this, who wouldn't have heard his teaching, wouldn't have seen his example, but they come, they run, they worship, they beg, they ask. Very positive examples. Now, as I've said, by contrast then, our poor disciples are seen time and time again in a negative light. Now, with that in mind, I want us to look at a guy about whom there's debate. Is this guy one of these minor ones? Is he commended? Or is this guy a bit like the disciples? Is he failing in some way? And this guy is found in chapter 10. And the whole point of him being included in Mark's gospel is that we have this conversation. Is he a minor one, a good guy, or is he like the 12 disciples, okay? And he's known as the rich young ruler. Now, he's certainly rich. We don't know, according to Mark's account, whether he's young. Both Matthew and Luke talk about this guy, and one of them tells us that he's young, but Mark himself doesn't. So let's look at him, okay? He's in Mark chapter 10, verses 17 through to 22. Now, as he was going out on the road, now remember Jesus is going to Jerusalem. As he's going out on the road, one came running, knelt before him and asked him. Now, there you go. You see, you got those action verbs. He runs, he kneels, he asks. So very much like the minor ones, these characters we've already met with their action verbs. And he says to him, "Good teacher, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, and that is God. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not defraud. Honor your father and your mother." Now he answered and said to Jesus, "Teacher, all these things I have kept from my youth." Then Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, "One thing you lack. Go your way, sell whatever you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, take up your cross and follow me." But he was sad at this word and went away sorrowful, for he had many possessions. Now, what do you think? Is this a minor one, a good guy? Or is this one like the disciples? He's disciple material, but how are we meant to make sense of this chap, okay? Let me just point out one or two things. He initially presents like one of these previous minor characters we've met, the good ones, and he calls Jesus good. Now, what Jesus does in verse 18 is he directs this man's attention to God. And he says there is only one who is good, and that is God. And that's a very unusual move that Jesus seems to make. And then he asks him about the law. But if you look at verse 19, Jesus asks him about the second table of the law, the table of the law that's dealing with our relationship to others, the 6 commandments, if you like, on the second table. Why does Jesus do that, do you think? Why doesn't he ask him about the first 4 commandments that deal with God? So he asks him about the 6, the social commandments. And verse 20, "Teacher, all these things I have kept from my youth." Now, if this guy is a young ruler, he hasn't been keeping them very long then, is he? But also what we're meant to ask is, to what extent has he kept them? And can you keep them? And is he being commended by Jesus for keeping the law? I mean, he's a very upright guy. But then Jesus looked at him and loved him. Now, that's hugely important. Only Mark tells us that Jesus loves this young man. And the word is the sort of agape word, the kind of action, that's a whole action in and of itself. He loved this man. And then he tells him what he lacks. And he lacks one thing. Sell your possessions, have treasure in heaven, and follow me. Now that seems to me to be more than one thing, but that's what Jesus says. One thing you lack. Now, as we think of this for a moment, possessions are not condemned in the Bible. We've looked at Genesis and we've looked at Exodus and Moses and Abraham and Jacob. They had great possessions. So possessions in and of themselves are not sinful. So why is Jesus saying to this man that his possessions resulting him lacking? So there's a contrast here between he has many possessions, but he lacks. So how can a man who has in abundance, how can he lack? And then Jesus says to him, "Come and follow me." Now this man is sad and sorrowful. and he goes away. And the disciples have watched this and they're amazed by it. And they're so amazed by it that they have a conversation with Jesus then about possessions and riches. And Jesus will say it's hard for somebody with wealth to enter the kingdom of God. It's easy for a camel and all that kind of thing. And there's this big discussion between Jesus then and the 12 about money and possessions. Don't forget Judas, the treasurer, would have heard and been part of that discussion. So what I'm asking you to think about is this young man good or bad? Does he fit with that whole series of characters we've seen? Or is he like one of the 12? Is that where he sits? The fact that he's included in all of the synoptic gospels is really interesting, because you wonder why he's there. And some people would say, well, this is an example of how Jesus deals with an individual in order to bring them to faith. He points them to God, he brings in the law, he shows them their lack. But to me, this man is meant to be an area of debate around where he fits. How do we categorize him in relation to the way that Mark has set up his gospel? The disciples are negative characters. We've got a series of good characters. Have a debate, Mark seems to be saying, about where this character fits. I want to show you one more thing in Mark's gospel, and that's known as the messianic secret. You may have heard of this, you may have read of this yourselves, that what Mark seems to do, the others do it as well, but it seems to be quite noticeable in Mark, is he presents us with what's known as the messianic secret. And that's the simple idea that the identity of Jesus wants to keep secret. He wants to keep secret the fact that he is the Messiah. And this is a theme that runs through Mark's gospel. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of how this secret is encouraged throughout Mark's gospel. So chapter 1 and verses 43. So this is the leper now that we've already met, one of the good minor ones. Chapter 1, verse 43, he strictly warned him and sent him away at once. Okay, he strictly warned him. And he then asks him to do what Moses commands. So Jesus is hiding his activity with the leper behind the instructions that Moses had and was given by God about those who've been cleansed from leprosy. And then as you go into chapter 5 and verse 43, you see the same idea. Keep it secret is what Jesus is saying to them. Mark 5 and verse 43. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it. So this is the girl who's restored to life and so on. Here is the secret again being enforced upon those whom Jesus has healed. Mark 5 and verse 43. He commanded them that strictly that no one should know it. And then another example of the secret is found after Peter confesses the identity of Jesus. So Mark chapter 8 and verse 30. So Peter's just confessed that Jesus is the Christ. And in verse 30, you find he strictly warns them that they should tell no one about it. You may find other examples in Mark of the secret, the messianic secret. And all the debate is around why. Why does Jesus command and insist on his identity as the Messiah being kept a secret? So whether it's a demon or a healed person or Peter, keep it secret is what Jesus seems to be insisting on. So I wonder what your thoughts are. There's a huge amount of literature and discussion around this idea of the messianic secret. And for some, the answer is found at the crucifixion. So if you think about the crucifixion then, in Mark 15, you've got a very well-known event that happens amongst the drama and the horror of the crucifixion that seems to many to be an answer to this idea of the messianic secret. So it's Mark 15, and the verse that we're going to look at is verse 39. Mark 15 and verse 39. So when the centurion who stood opposite him saw that he cried out like this and breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." It's as if the secret was revealed, was what you do with a secret, share it or spoil it or whatever, by a Roman centurion. The idea that Mark, writing for a Roman audience, for Christians who were possibly Gentile Christians, he wants the fact that one of theirs was able to recognize that Jesus is the Son of God, is the Messiah, that the acknowledgement comes from the audience that Mark is writing for. Mark isn't writing as an evangelist. He's not writing to convert people. John does that. Mark is writing for a Christian Gentile audience. And he's writing about how the Roman world crucified him, but the Roman power recognized that here you have the Son of God whilst he was upon the cross. So the messianic secret then. Last thing, and this is only getting to know Mark's gospel, chapter 16 is the account of the resurrection. And there's a verse in chapter 16 that many believe isn't authentic. That was a later insertion into the gospel. And you know that verse, I'm sure, it's verse 18. Mark 16, verse 18. So this is the Great Commission. Out go the apostles to preach, and there will be signs that follow them. And you got verse 18. They will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. And they will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. It's the idea of signs following the preaching of the resurrection of Jesus. And it's the idea of the serpents and the drinking poison that people feel is inconsistent somehow with the ministry and the person of Christ. Now, of course, you've got cults who practice holding serpents and daring their believers and followers to be bitten by them. And you've also got some cults who practice drinking poison as evidence of their faith in the resurrected Jesus. So there's Mark's gospel, everyone. Thank you very much. So I think I finished recording.